Welcome to the March 2020 edition of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection. Today we have with us Joe Campolo. Welcome, Joe. Managing partner of Campolo, Middleton McCormick, a Forbes top trusted corporate law firm in America. He's also the chairman of Protegrity Advisors, CMM Coverage, and CMM Strategies. Joe has spent many years discussing the art of contract negotiation. He's going to share some of that knowledge with us. So welcome, Joe.
Hey, Ken.
So before we get started, you want to talk a little bit about how Campolo Middleton McCormick works with the nonprofit sector?
Sure. And first of all, Ken, I want to thank you. I mean, you're humble with regard to how your impact has been on not-for-profits. But on Long Island and certainly in the state of New York, your listeners should know that you've probably been the number one driving force, certainly here on Long Island and in New York. And I give you kudos to that. Your Imagine Awards have become legendary and incredible, and I want to thank you.
Well, legendary in my mind, at least.
Yeah, well, and really, really great. And, you know, we and it's funny, we were just talking about how we used to share space and rent space here in your building, and, you know, you were always an inspiration to us, and it really impacted our organization to be more involved in the not-for-profit sector, and we do it in a lot of ways. You know, first of all, myself and many of our team members serve on not-for-profit boards. Right? We volunteer a lot of time and dollars, including many large and prestigious organizations like the Guide Dog Foundation, the Tesla Science Center, the Girl Scouts of America, the American Red Cross, Stahler Center, the Family Service League, organizations that you've been involved in and know. And again, you served as a big inspiration. We also recently started our own 501c3 charitable foundation, CMM Cares.
Great.
Yep. And we're raising significant funds and supporting 3 critical missions through CMM Cares right now, veterans, the arts, and children. And CMM Strategies, so you mentioned CMM Strategies, and what we do a lot of corporate training on leadership development and teamwork development, and a lot of not-for-profits have asked us to come in and help train their fundraising and development teams as well as their leadership teams to be able to do that. And we've done that with a bunch of very large not-for-profits as well. We do that to help them with their mission. So, you know, we're pretty engaged.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's, I guess, start off with, I mean, the topic for today is really talking about negotiation and how to negotiate effectively. Why is it important to have strong negotiation skills?
Well, everything's a negotiation. Everything's a negotiation, you know.
I don't know. In my house, there's no negotiation.
Well, that just means you're a bad negotiator, but everything in life is a negotiation. And so when you're looking at, and let's just use an executive director or a CEO of a not-for-profit, for example, right? They have to be doing a negotiation with their board, right? Mm-hmm. Because they want to get their board to spring into action and have deliverables. From a fundraising perspective, it's all a negotiation. You have to convince the person that you're trying to raise funds from that their funds are receiving value for those funds and what they're going to be doing. And so, you know, negotiation is not just I have a contract or I want to get this point across. Your negotiation is everything we do in life. Elected officials negotiate with us by trying to get a vote. You know, a negotiation takes place when you pull your car up to a gas station because you've accepted that that's the price for gas. So negotiation permeates every bit of an organization, particularly not-for-profit organizations, because donors are not really getting anything tangible back for that, right? It's a feel-good, or they get a tax.
It depends on how that relationship is set up too, because I mean, one of the things that we stress in working with the for-profit population these days is, you know, how do you create a two-way street? So really that negotiation, how do you create a win-win situation? So, you know, hopefully the nonprofit gets the money and the for-profit gets something in return in terms of...
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's exactly how we work with not-for-profits as well. So if we're going to support a not-for-profit, we'll sit down and we'll negotiate, right, kind of what we want our funds to be used for and sort of what sort of sponsorships or what sort of interaction with the organization we want to do. And so, you know, executive directors, directors of advancement, board members, everybody involved in a not-for-profit should be mindful of negotiation strategies and should be using them to try and maximize value to their organization.
So when we're talking about negotiation, I think a lot of people, when they consider negotiation, they think of winning and losing, but it's not really a win-lose situation. It's how do I further what I'm trying to accomplish within my organization through any level of communication or coordination or any of those things, which really then take into effect some level of negotiation from what I'm hearing.
Exactly right. For me, I always view negotiation, and I try and train people negotiation to basically view it as how can I get as much value as I can out of this, right? And take as little risk in getting that value. And good negotiators, there's an old line: if it bends, it's good. If it breaks, it's not good. And good negotiators will learn how to bend it to the point where it's not going to break. You know, also skilled negotiators are going to, the saying I like to use is, a skilled negotiator is going to negotiate a deal where you leave it thinking you got exactly what you wanted, right? Not necessarily that I feel good about what I wanted, because that's the point of a negotiation, but I also want you to feel good, like you got something out of it as well. And in the not-for-profit sector especially, you need to have that sort of camaraderie and goodwill at the negotiating table, because people don't have a shortage of not-for-profits that they could be supporting, and so you want to protect and preserve the relationship. So it used to be win-win, right? You strive for win-win. And when I studied, I did 2 advanced courses at the Harvard Negotiating Project, and the first one I did about 8 years ago, and win-win was what they were talking about. There's this big book called Getting the Yes, which I strongly recommend. It was all about win-win. I took another advanced course maybe 3 years ago, and they changed that now to be, the goal of a good negotiation is to be win, not lose, right? You can win, and I don't want the other side to lose. And so that's a really important thing in a not-for-profit setting, is you want everybody to come out of that feeling like they got something.
So when you're looking at as you talked about skilled negotiator, what are the skill sets that a skilled negotiator should have in play in order to make them effective?
Well, the number one thing is listening. Okay, listening.
I'm sorry, what?
Listening.
Oh,
exactly. Okay. So Grandma always says that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should always be listening twice as much as we should be talking, right? And when we listen, we start to pick up a lot of information as to what the other side thinks is valuable, right? What the other side is value. And then we can start formulating trades from a negotiation. Preparation is also the number one thing that a good negotiator utilizes, right? If you're going to be negotiating with a donor or a fundraiser, you should be very, very prepared. And there's no shortage of ways to prepare yourself now, with LinkedIn, with Facebook, with all these tools we have, because at the end of the day, people are still going to do business with people they like, right? They already know the missions are great. They already know that, but there's no shortage. And so they're going to do business with people they like, and they're going to like people that they feel they have an affinity with. And so you should be, instead of what I try to tell, especially with the not-for-profit organizations that I help train, and I just did a big seminar for the Stony Brook advancement team. What I try to say to them is, don't even talk about the services. Don't even talk about anything. Build an affinity first, right? Build an affinity, build a likability factor, because then when you are going to make an ask, it's going to be so much easier because they like you. And when somebody likes you, you know what it's like. When somebody likes you, you just get a better deal out of them than when somebody doesn't like you. And so it's really important to listen, to be prepared, and to focus on likability versus, just the nuts and bolts of exactly what that don would mean.
Okay. And again, this works in not just donations, but like if you're trying to negotiate a lease or anything else, the likability factor still comes into play?
100%. So I like to give people the example of going into your favorite restaurant, right? Your favorite restaurant is your favorite restaurant, not just because of the food, right? It's because you feel liked and respected there, and everybody goes the extra mile because they like you, and you're going to get better service, and you're going to get better at that. So you're always going to get a better deal, always going to get a better deal when you're dealing with people. And in the not-for-profit sector, it's a people business, okay? You're always going to get a better deal when people like you. You're going to get a better deal. And one of the things from a negotiating perspective that I think not-for-profits have to be mindful and careful of, is not trying to play the sympathy card too much, like, oh, we're a not-for-profit, so we want a better deal, because I don't think that always works, right? I think if when they're negotiating, you want to say that you're a not-for-profit, but I think you should also say, we're a great organization and we're doing all these wonderful things, and we're really building a lot of value here, and that will get you a better deal.
Okay, so you had said, like, when you're talking to a donor, I mean, one of the things that you want to do is you want to get into that likability piece. But then there's also all of the impact and everything else that we do as a nonprofit organization. When does the impact component, when does all of that stuff come on the table in terms of discussion within the negotiation? When does the real nuts and bolts and the facts, when does all that kind of get pushed out there.
To me, that's the way you end the conversation that you're having. You know, it's and I can share an example. It's not in a not-for-profit setting, but I think it's very illustrative. I was meeting with a prospective client the other day from my law firm, and it was a well-known company, and they were asking 3 law firms to come and meet, and they had a very specific need. And the strategy I used, because when I met the CEO, we got along really well. And so the strategy I used was not to talk about our firm or our capabilities at all until the very end of the conversation. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand his organization, trying to get to know him better. And then at the end of it, I said, oh, and by the way, Forbes just recognized us as a top trusted corporate law firm. And he was like, wow, I'm surprised you didn't lead off with that. And I said, I wanted to be a little bit different. I wanted us to build a rapport. I didn't want you to think I was just selling. And he said, well, it worked. Congratulations. I want to work with you. I mean, that, and look, like you, I've given a lot of time and money to not-for-profits. And it's a little distasteful when the first thing out of the box is talking about, the impact. Show me that you are interested in me and not my wallet. Show me that you know who I am and what I'm doing and how I'm sort of building my business. Talk to me about how you can help me grow my business too, through relationships and everything else, so that it's a win, not lose relationship. And then once all of that I'm excited about, then you'll close me by saying, and by the way, if you give me X dollars, I'm going to be able to do all this with programming to enhance this. That to me is a much more impactful way to negotiate it.
Okay, so if I'm looking at different types of negotiations, because I might be working with another nonprofit where I'm looking to collaborate with that other nonprofit. I might be looking to work from a donation perspective with a donor. I may be trying to get the board to agree on raises for the staff or what union. I mean, a lot of nonprofit organizations have to deal with union issues. I would think that my strategy needs to be different in each one of the cases that I'm going at. How do I determine what strategy to use in each case? How do I determine what to lead with and everything else? Again, and you're not going to be able to give every single example, every single situation, but just some general guidelines in terms of, how to look at the different pieces and, the different negotiation type situations you may fall in and decide how do you handle each one of those.
Right. So I think people, when they're thinking about how to negotiate with somebody else, they focus on positions instead of focusing on interests, right? They focus on what they want their position to be and the outcome of that negotiation. And I think to look at each individual type of setting on its own, as long as you focus on what the other side's interests are and what your interests are, you'll be able to have the right strategy in terms of how to get there. So if 2 not-for-profits are negotiating, right, to sort of collaborate together, well, what are the interests? Maybe somebody has an overage of staff at that moment, and they're looking to outsource some staff so they can remain more viable. Maybe somebody's looking for use of a network or use of some other facilities or resources that they have, right? But the interests that you would want to start with is, if we do this, we're both going to be stronger, okay? We're both going to be more viable, and it's going to keep our market alive and robust, right? That's in everybody's interest, competitors, non-competitors alike. If you just approach that and say, I need to offset some staff and I need you to help me, it becomes a much more narrow discussion. And it's all about, a good negotiation is all about opening up as many options and opportunities as possible, right? I call it increasing the pie. So if there's only a little pie and you're trying to whack it up, then it's very difficult because you don't have a lot of options. So really good negotiators will sit down and start and talk about, these are all the possibilities that could exist if we work together. That makes both of our pies bigger, and that makes it easier to give up some of the pie because I've now grown the value of that pie. So I think that's a really good way to start. And then once you understand the interests of the other side, right, then you can start to narrow the strategies to get there.
Okay. And what happens if you start going through the negotiations and because you said before that a good negotiator knows how to bend the stick without breaking it. So how do you know where that bend point is? How do you know when maybe a negotiation starting to go south and you need to reel back in or something?
Right. So a lot of that you gain from experience, right? A lot of it is common sense, I would say. What I find is the best tool to use is be mindful of timing and pace, right? you don't want to enter a negotiation and be too aggressive. So I'll go back to a donor, and this is sort of how I talk to the advancement team at Stony Brook. It's like you want to find an appropriate pace for that donor. So for an example, at an initial meeting, you don't want to have a hard sell. You want to have an introductory meeting, get to know them, understand, what they're sort of looking to do from a philanthropic position, and talk about some of the opportunities you have. And then, to keep that negotiation alive and that conversation alive, what I suggest asking at that point is, how would you prefer I follow up with you, and what's your timing, right? Because if you don't ask that type of critical question, then you're hurting yourself in the negotiation, because you now are dealing with the unknown. If you hawk them, if you're reaching out to them too much and in a way that they don't appreciate, then you're going to hurt the relationship that way. If you don't reach out to them in enough time, they may have moved on to another opportunity, right? And so I think sometimes socially, we feel awkward having sort of conversations like that. But really what we need to do is figure out, what is your interest? How would you prefer I communicate with you? What do you suggest the timing is? And continue that conversation alone. That gives you, again, that likability factor, which is so important to fundraising, because people are going to give money generally. Okay, because an organization, if they're interested in that organization's mission, they're probably looking at other organizations that have that mission, and they're generally going to give money to the organization that they like, right? That's who they're going to do. And so we really want to focus on that likability factor. And that comes down to just being respectful and mindful of how I spend my time and how I prefer communications.
So that means then you need to do as you said before, you need to do your homework. You need to learn about the individual. You have to ask the right questions to find out what drives that individual and why that individual is interested in your organization to begin with, so that you can then, as you said before, build that pie by talking about other things that the organization may do that the donor wasn't even aware of, or potential donor isn't even aware of. So those types of things are what nonprofits should be looking at and should be trying to handle in that process.
Absolutely. And I think LinkedIn has become a great tool that people just don't utilize, right? People want to post their pictures and their stuff on LinkedIn, and that's great. But to me, I view LinkedIn as a research tool, right? And it gives me really good nuggets of information, particularly if somebody's, prospecting a donor, because people have listed out either boards they serve on or have served on, or things that they've done from a charitable foundation. And I think that research going into a meeting gets you valuable information to ask, why did you support them? What did you appreciate about supporting them? What was it that you were looking for? Really find little things to build affinity. When I served on the alumni board at Stony Brook, credit card revenue was very, very important, because they had these programs with affinity credit cards, and credit card companies would go out and you'd be able to put your university logo on the credit card, and the university would get 1% of that. And I learned all about this affinity market. And the research in the psychology is people are generally more inclined to give you money if they feel they have a direct connection to it. So you can almost find anything you can directly connect to with a person if you do enough research. One of the things that I tell all the time to the fundraisers, to the CEO of organizations, is try and change even your web bios to include personal information. So like, for example, on my web bio, I have my professional things, but I also have that I'm a member at a certain golf club, and I've done certain recreational things, and I was involved in making a movie and all that other stuff. Because if I'm negotiating with somebody, right, I want to have a connection with them on many levels, and that's always going to help the negotiation. So it does help. So information and personalizing the information truly helps the negotiation process.
Okay. When you're in a negotiation, again, I know I don't necessarily play cards, or if I do, I don't play well. And I'm sure that I have like a million tells, but like in the negotiation process, are you actually looking for tells and things like that also when you're trying to negotiate with someone to try to understand, where that bend point ends? Or is it really more just that, casual conversation discussion sort of thing to try to feel them out?
Well, I don't believe anybody should go into a negotiation unprepared, right? And you should appear as if you're unprepared in the negotiation, but you should be supremely prepared. And what I mean by that is you should have a checklist, and I write it down. Honestly, I write the information and the questions I'm looking to get answered ever so subtly. And you should be directing that conversation in a very friendly way, but in a way that's eliciting information that's going to help you figure out how to advance your position in the negotiation, right?
You want to give me like some examples or how that works?
Yeah, sure. I don't remember it offhand, but there's a 7-point checklist that I use, and I can send it to you, and you can send it out to your listeners,
Okay.
Separately. But it really is a strategic way of thinking where I go into a negotiation. And so you mentioned a lease, right? And so they have to negotiate with their landlord, and they have to understand the landlords. Well, a landlord's interest for the most part is they want to maximize the revenue that they're going to be able to get out of that space. Okay. But that's not their only interest. They're the landlord. So if you're co-tenants, and you and I used to be co-tenants, right? Expansion and contraction is another issue, right? Bank financing is another issue. There's a whole host of other issues that could be very important to negotiating that lease. None of which the landlord cares that you're the greatest not-for-profit in the world doing charitable organizations, because still their primary interest is going to be in maximizing revenue, right? But when you start looking at different checklists for different industries and start asking the right questions, all of a sudden you can build a much more valuable lease, which is the end product, right? Which contains things that the landlord cares about and that you care about, and negotiate it, sort of that way.
So you're talking about things like extensions, increases in rates, all of those things.
Yeah.
And all of those have value.
All of those have absolute value. One of the things that, and I'll just use this as an example with our current landlord, one of the things that were really important to us was having a right of first refusal on any space that came available in the business, because I wanted to bet on growth, and one of the things that was really important to the landlord was being able to use us in promotional materials and everything else if he wanted to sell the building, right? And so if we hadn't had a discussion, if we had just, worried about price and everything else, we would have never found a way to come to that agreement and conclusion.
So again, that comes back to what my next question was going to be. I mean, again, if you're looking at, all of these, when you think in any deal, there's these surface issues that everybody can obviously see the surface issues, but then you also have those issues that are underneath the surface that maybe aren't as readily visible. How do you, and I guess maybe through that conversation or interaction, but how do you really determine, like for you, you said what's important for you in the lease was the ability to have access or first right of refusal to any additional space. You assigned a value to that in your thought process. How do I, through a negotiation, if I'm the landlord, determine what your value is on that so I can kind of use that in my negotiation technique, just like you found as the potential tenant that what's important for them is the marketing component of it.
Right. So I think that people need to understand that the key to a good negotiation is you got to be transparent. You got to be strategic about when you let facts out. I understand that everybody's very nervous.
Everybody tends to hold things tight to the vest because they're afraid if I give. It's like you go in to buy a house, and you love the house. You don't want to get excited about it because then no one's going to negotiate on the price.
But if you can't find the fair price, you're going to lose the house anyway, right? So there has to be some ability to tell information, and you have to have a trust. So you want to build trust, and the easiest way I find in a negotiation to build trust is to be the first one to give up some information, right? Because if you give up some information, you're gonna be able to tell, because either that's going to put the other person at ease and they're going to give you some information, or they're not, and then you're going to realize that you're not negotiating with somebody who's transparent and who's trustworthy that way, that they're going to look to exploit information. And I think that that's very dangerous. And I would think specifically if you're talking about a donor, you want to know that information, right away. And I think everybody's very close with information, and I don't necessarily agree with that. When I go into a negotiation, I'll always have my notes written down of what the things are that I want to accomplish, and I'll be thinking about strategies and trades that I can use with it. So when you think about a contract, Ken, and people think contracts are boring, but contracts basically are our way in this country of memorializing what the negotiated deal was and agreed to, right? And the way I train my young attorneys especially is to say a contract is a puzzle. It's a puzzle, right?
Okay.
And you're going to bring some pieces of that puzzle, and I'm going to bring some pieces of that puzzle. And a good contract at the end of the day, all of your pieces are going to be part of that puzzle, and all of my pieces are going to be part of that puzzle. And it's all going to make sense together, right? Because I was able to use all your pieces and I was able to use all my pieces. What happens in bad negotiations is you get a contract that's Swiss cheese, because some of your pieces weren't used, all of mine were used, or some of my pieces weren't used, and some of your pieces weren't used because we didn't find a way, and each piece represents value. We didn't find a way to utilize those puzzle pieces the right way, and you wind up with Swiss cheese. So really good negotiators are going to be able to sit down and make sure that by the time they're done, all of your puzzle pieces, which are your negotiated value pieces that you want have been used, all of mine have been used, and we made one comprehensive puzzle out of it together. And I think that that's a very good way to visualize what a good negotiation is about.
So the more pieces we get into the puzzle, the more everybody gets that win, not lose feel out of the whole thing.
Exactly right. Because if at the end of the day, if those puzzles represent, potential value to you, those puzzle pieces, if at the end of the day, when we're done, you're sitting, you still have 3 puzzle pieces, it means you have 3 moves, 3 pieces of value you didn't obtain in that negotiation, right? And so like a puzzle, when you're looking at all the pieces, you're trying to figure out what piece is going to match with this, and how do I get this together, and how can I make this, whole? And so if you are dealing with, another good negotiator who's negotiating in good faith, you won't end that negotiation until everybody's utilized all their puzzle pieces.
So if I'm understanding this right, and again, you're the pro at negotiations, Joe, not me, but if I'm understanding this right, if I'm sitting here and I've got all my pieces of the puzzle on, and you're sitting here and you didn't get 3 pieces of the puzzle on, you're unhappy because you didn't get 3 pieces. I think I'm happy because I got all my pieces on, but because you're unhappy, you may go to do another deal down the street, which allows you to get all of your pieces of puzzle in, and then I lose.
Correct. And that's win-lose, right? And that's exactly what you don't want to play. And you know what? In a cutthroat business world like hedge funds or venture capital, they play win-lose, right? Because to them, dollars are it. In a not-for-profit sector, you can't play win-lose because you don't know where your next donor is going to be, and you don't know where your next dollar is going to be. And there shouldn't be an end to these discussions and these negotiations until you're very, very comfortable that the potential donor or the other person that you're negotiating with has gotten enough value out of their puzzle pieces, right? And so even if you've gotten all your puzzle pieces done, if they have 1 or 2 puzzle pieces left, you have to make sure that there's not another way to do it so that they can fit their pieces in there, and they may say, you know what, I'm good. This is good. I really appreciate it. Everything's good and I'm good to go. Okay, then that's win, not lose, right? That's win, not lose. That's exactly where you want to get it out. But you have to be always checking in and making sure that they feel they're getting adequate value. 2 pieces are coming together, because that's going to be the strongest relationship. If you think of a puzzle, when it's done, it's strong. If it has holes in it, it's not.
I think a lot of people go with that win-lose situation and not really focused on, hey, how do I set up a deal where everybody walks away from the table either happy or quasi-happy?
And I typically, in any context, I typically will start out every negotiation by saying, that my commitment is to make sure that everybody has maximized the value that's possible out of a deal. Not every deal has the ability for everybody to get win-win. That's why win, not lose has been kind of the standard. But I'll preface that right away. And I think from a fundraising perspective, that's very important to say, look, we want to make sure that you're getting maximum value from us, and I'm doing everything I can to help you feel like you're getting maximum value from this organization. So we're gonna discuss this and structure it for as long as it takes to make sure that you're comfortable with that. And that lets people feel really comfortable about it.
Okay. So we talked about, one of the things that could go wrong is that one of the sides doesn't have all the puzzle pieces in the puzzle. What are some of the other pitfalls that somebody could, or that you could fall into when you're sitting here negotiating a deal?
Well, first of all is time wasting. Okay. So from an advancement perspective, right, you got to recognize, because you have limited time and you have limited resources, and you have to recognize as whether or not the prospect that you are talking to is ever actually going to close a deal with you, no matter how much value you offer them, or whether you're just negotiating and wasting your time with somebody who's not going to pull the trigger, right? And that is a really important part to the negotiating dance when it comes from an advancement.
And how do you determine if the other side is operating in good faith or not?
Well, it's, again, part experience, but you have to start using things to advance the negotiation forward. So if we're talking about puzzle pieces, right? I think it becomes very appropriate to say, okay, so at our last discussion, you asked me for these 3 particular puzzle pieces. I've put these 3 puzzle pieces on the table, right? And, is that making you more comfortable to now move the relationship forward? And if they say yes, and because of that, I'm willing to put another puzzle piece or 2 on the table, great. Then you're making progress and you're negotiating in good faith. If they say no, or I want to think about it, or they no responsive, then that they're not really looking to make a puzzle with you.
How do you know that all the puzzle pieces are on the table? Because, I mean, I've seen many a deal where, you're negotiating a deal, you get to a point where you think everything is good, and then the other side throws on 3 more puzzle pieces. It's that old, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, that's a great question, right? That's the art of negotiation. That's why it's an art and not a science. And that's the point of where it bends, before it breaks. But there are really some good tools to use. One is that I find when you're negotiating, particularly if you're negotiating face-to-face or over the phone, that it really helps to keep the relationship moving by putting a written communication afterwards into place, right? Magic happens when people put things in writing. They feel that a much bigger level of commitment. So if somebody has a meeting and you're having a meeting with the potential donor, and it was a good meeting, and they said, great, follow up with me in 3 weeks, and I want to find this information, it's critical that you follow up with a polite email, basically confirming what they said, confirming what they've committed to, and that you will be following up in 3 weeks. Growing the pie is the most critical thing. So bad fundraisers are going to tell you, we need a new generator for the building, and it's going to cost us $50,000, and we want you to underwrite the generator, right? It's a bad fundraiser. They're going to do that. A good fundraiser is going to make the pie much, much bigger, because if you think I'll give you $50,000 for a generator, right? Well, I might give you $500,000
for a building.
A building, right? So bad fundraisers just stay on as little of the pie as possible, right? And you can't jump to conclusions, but you have to paint a much bigger picture, even when you have a much smaller ask. Because that's the number one mistake that I see people doing in a negotiation, is they ask for too little. They're afraid to ask for too much, and I get that. Okay, but they ask for too little. Now, you don't do it in a sleazy used car salesman type of way, because that can turn people off. For an example, I was looking, I'll give you another perfect real world example of a bad negotiation. I was looking for a place in South Florida because I wanted to be able to play golf and bring clients down to play golf in the wintertime, right? Because my golf game is terrible and I wanted to play. And so I had a broker that I called, and I said, look, I'm looking for a small condo in one of the golf communities down here. Here's my budget. Can you help me? Right? And rather than finding a bunch of different units that fit that description, he decided that he was going to upsell me immediately and show me units that were 5x what I was looking to spend. Right? And I didn't want to do that. Like, I gave you my budget. Right? I didn't want to feel bad about myself now, like, well, I can't afford the 5X one, and now I got to get a crappy little condo. I didn't want to feel bad about myself. I just wanted to feel good about having a place to go play golf in the winter. It was a terrible, terrible sales tool, okay? The way I would have done it if I was him, and I told him this, I said, I'm not going to use your services, and I'm going to tell you why. The way I would have done it is I would have found 3 or 4 that met my budget. I would have found 1 that exceeded my budget, and I would have found 1 that was below my budget, and it would have made me feel good about my budget. It's the same in fundraising. If somebody says, I'm looking to give you $5,000 for a particular sponsorship, that's great. Then when you sit down, I would paint, all the value you can give them for $5,000, and then talk about how there's more value available if they're interested in doing other things, but make them feel good and comfortable about what their initial budget level is. But your job is to try and extract as much value as there could possibly be. And we don't know if they're sitting on a bunch of other puzzle pieces, but you can't make them feel badly about it. One of the things that's always confused me about fundraising and like golf outings is they'll have set sponsorships and they'll list out what you get, and people will write checks, and that's sort of how they do it. I really think that that's, bad practice. I really think you should be having a discussion with the other person and find out what do they think would be valuable for that dollar amount. Because maybe there's just something much more simple that would be valuable for them for that amount, which doesn't even cost the organization as much as it does, right? But we've gotten into this sort of cookie cutter. Here's a platinum sponsorship, here's a silver sponsorship, here's a gold sponsorship, and that's it. And you have to talk to people, because when you do, I find they're willing to give you much more money than if you just mail them out something for a dollar amount.
I think coming back to what you said, I think, not everybody is motivated by the same stuff. And if you can find out what makes a person tick, you're in a much better situation than to, negotiate a deal that's a win, not lose deal.
Yeah, and it's even good practice. Look, if somebody I would go so far to even say, even if you have a $5,000 sponsorship to a golf outing that includes these certain things, when somebody signs up for it, I would think the better practice would be to call that person, thank them for their check, make sure that they find those things valuable, or maybe if there's something else they would find more valuable, to try and accommodate them. Because when I hear that, if I gave you the $5,000, it means I can afford $7,000, right? That's what it kind of means. And so when I feel like somebody's trying to make sure I'm getting extra value out of it, I'm going to be inclined to want to give more.
Okay. So we talked about some of the things that a good negotiator should do. How do you become a good negotiator? What are the skill sets? What are the things I got to put in play? What are the steps I have to take to become a good negotiator?
Well, you can learn it. So first of all, the thing is you can learn it. And there's no shortage of books. There's no shortage of YouTube videos. There's no shortage of stuff that people can learn, the tactics of it. The number one thing that I think people should be aware of is there's a spectrum in negotiation, right? There's empathy on one side, and there's assertiveness on the other side. Some people think being a good negotiator means you have to be very aggressive and very assertive. It's not true. Some people give up so much value in negotiating because they're just so empathetic, right? And some people think that if you're empathetic, you're a weak negotiator. That's not true. At every point in every negotiation, some of the positions you're going to have to take are going to be a little bit more assertive, and some of the positions you have to take are going to be a little bit more empathetic, right? Because that's just the push-pull of when you give and when you take, right? And so you can read and you can learn the skills, but the number one thing you can do to make yourself a better negotiator is to learn yourself, learn your personality, okay? And start working on yourself, because if you're not able to be a little bit more assertive at times, you got to train yourself to be a little bit more assertive at times. And if you are not able to be a little bit more empathetic at times, you need to train yourself to be a little bit more empathetic at times, right? It can't be an emotionally based. It has to appear as if it's emotionally based, but this is a real cerebral process that can be learned, that we can be using. And as lawyers, they kind of teach you that in law school, but not really. It's taken years and years and years of reading and attending seminars and training, because negotiation is all I do every day, all day for clients. It's all I do. And so it's something that I really had to look at myself. So here I am, and I'm a white male who was a Marine, and a lawyer, and people are going to think that I'm going to be very aggressive and very assertive at all times. That's just the presumption they have. So I really had to, change my approach and appear very empathetic from the beginning to get rid of that preconceived notion right away.
Okay. Now, when we look at a deal, and one of the things you had said earlier is a lot of times you'll put stuff on the table right away in terms of sharing information and everything else. I've heard in the past that, the first one to blink loses, in essence, where, if I'm sitting here and I'm trying to negotiate let's say a purchase of a car, if I throw out, all right, I'm willing to pay $50,000 for a car, I've just set the floor. Okay. And now you're saying that that's not necessarily the case. Now, I think that's what I heard. So how do I get to a point where in a negotiation, should I be the first one to share what I'm willing to pay, or what I'm willing to do, or what I'm willing to put on the table? Should I wait? How do you get somebody to put that first chip on the table? And
that's a great question, right? And everybody's nervous, and it's always sometimes super awkward that people are just staring at each other and no one wants to give information. Why
don't you tell me? Why don't you tell me?
Right. And what I like to tell people is use assumptions. Okay, use assumptions. So one of the things, and we have a pretty robust mergers and acquisitions practice where people are going to buy a business and people are going to sell a business, and you have to give some information at some point, right? And so now it's all based on assumptions. So for a car, for example, you have to put it in context that if this car is able to satisfy my needs and I feel that the quality's there after I test drive it and everything else, I might be willing to pay $50,000 for it, right? So now you've given yourself a gauge, a test to see how they feel about that price, right? But you've also given yourself out because you based it on assumptions, right? So you always have to build in some sort of assumption, right? And that's what I think the ask would be. So when I'm talking to people, so let's say someone from an advancement approaches me, and I'm going to say, look, I'm very interested in meeting business owners because my whole practice is business owners. What are your events like? Who typically attends them? Who are your other donors? What do they do? Are you going to be able to introduce me to more business owners? That's sort of how I'll approach the conversation, right? And then at the second meeting, when an ask is made, I'm going to say, okay, if you can demonstrate to me that I'm going to be able to meet business owners and it can be a win-win, then I might be willing to give X, right? And then they're going to come back and put another puzzle piece on the table at that point and say, here's, a typical attendee list. Here's our board list. I'd be willing to introduce you to all these people so that you'd be able to have direct access to them. And then at that point, the move's mine. And then I say, okay, it's either worth it or it's not at that point.
So it's kind of like a chess match.
Always a chess match. Always a chess match. And you always have to give yourself an out by qualifying it. If this, then I might be able to do this. And that takes the pressure off of it because you don't want to be, a dirtbag. You don't want to be the guy who said, well, I said I would pay this and now I'm reneging and I'm not saying that. Nobody wants to do that because we're good people. You make the assumption they're good people. But when you give yourself an out by using qualifying language like that and using, these conditions, it makes it much more easier to just say, you know what, it doesn't really fit my need. I would have been able to do that, but it doesn't really fit my need. That's a much, much more easy way to get out of it.
Okay, so we always have these things that you don't know what you don't know. So obviously, you're the expert in negotiations. I'm not. So what else would you like to share with the listeners in terms of other things that they should be thinking about from a negotiation perspective that maybe we haven't talked about so far?
Plan B. So Plan B. In the negotiating geek world, they call it your BATNA. Your best...
Your what?
BATNA. Not Batman. BATNA.
Sorry, go ahead.
What is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? Okay. BATNA, yeah. BATNA's big. BATNA's big in negotiation world. And that's basically Plan B, right? And so particularly in a donor setting, you want to give them a Plan B. You want to give them a little bit of relief, right? So that if they are truly uncomfortable giving at the level that you want to give, it's not an all or nothing proposition. There's a Plan B.
So that's like when the lawyer puts on the table in terms of charges, murder one or manslaughter.
Right.
So there's always a fallback position.
Correct. And it was, when I was looking for a condo in Florida, if the broker had known what he was doing, right, he would have given me three options. He would have given me a high, a medium, which is where I wanted to be, and a low, so that I would have been comfortable in any direction being it, right? And that's exactly, you always want to have a Plan B. We'd love for you to be a major sponsor. We would be able to create all this other value. It would be wonderful. But of course, if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, here's another option, a Plan B, okay, which will make you much more comfortable. Now, you as a good guy are going to want to support the organization, right? And if you can afford that bigger ask, you're going to want to do it if that person's negotiating right. And if you really aren't comfortable with that, you're going to want to be a good guy and go with Plan B anyway, right? And so you don't want to waste any time in that negotiation.
And does that work in just about any negotiation? Because we're talking about it from a development perspective, but what happens if I'm trying to negotiate a lease, or what happens if I'm trying to negotiate a sale of a business, or any of those types of things? How does that Plan B fall into play?
Plan B is alternatives. This is my preferred spot, but I need to be looking at other spots as well, because if this one doesn't work out, I need to have a Plan B to get into another spot. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. You just can't. You can't fall in love with any deal. You can't fall in love with any donor. You can't fall in love with any condo. You have to have a Plan B.
Okay. Awesome. So what are the key takeaways for today?
For me, it's listen, right? Gather as much information as you can. Prepare, right? Really be prepared to try and build an affinity with that person, because likability, I think, is the most important thing in a negotiation. You're always going to get a better deal, and you're always going to give a better deal, right? Because the goal is win or win not lose,
yeah.
Right? So you want to give a better deal and you want to get a better deal so you can maintain that relationship. and be very, very mindful of when you need to be empathetic and assertive in a negotiation.
Awesome. I actually feel like I know much more about negotiations. I actually feel like I could actually go and negotiate a deal with my wife.
Great.
I still won't win, but I feel like I could at least get to the table there. So thanks a lot, Joe, for all your help here. And for everyone else, tune in on April 17th when our guest will be Kevin Urso, President of Connected Technologies. He'll be sharing with us some important updates relating to cybersecurity, which I know is a big topic for everyone. So
absolutely.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Thanks, Ken.